What makes this kind of loneliness especially difficult to recognize is that it doesn't come from rejection in the traditional sense. No one necessarily pushes you away. No dramatic fallout happens. People don't disappear overnight. Instead, contact fades gradually, conversations become shorter, plans become harder to coordinate, everyone seems occupied, including you. And because everyone appears to be in the same situation, it's easy to assume this is simply how adulthood works. You tell yourself that this is just what life looks like now, that closeness was something for earlier years, something that belonged to school, to youth, to simpler schedules and fewer responsibilities. You start to believe that distance is a natural consequence of growing up. And in some ways, that's true. Life does become more complex. Time becomes more fragmented. Energy becomes more limited. But complexity alone doesn't explain why so many people feel unseen even when surrounded by others. What really changes is not the amount of people in your life, but the quality of presence. You might talk to more people than ever before, yet feel less known. You exchange words constantly, but rarely feel understood. And over time, this creates a subtle emotional imbalance. You are socially active, but relationally undernourished. At first, this imbalance creates a low-level discomfort, a sense that something is missing, even if you can't name it. You might feel restless for no obvious reason. You might feel tired despite resting. You might feel irritable in situations that never used to bother you. But instead of tracing these feelings back to disconnection, you attribute them to stress, workload, or mood. Those explanations are easier. They don't require change. Eventually, even that discomfort fades. Not because the need disappears, but because the mind learns to dampen it. Humans have an incredible ability to normalize deprivation when it occurs slowly enough. Just as people adjust to noise, to clutter, to constant stimulation, they also adjust to emotional absence. The nervous system recalibrates. What once felt insufficient now feels adequate. This recalibration has consequences. When you expect less from connection, you offer less in return. You become more reserved, more selective, more cautious. You stop sharing parts of yourself that require effort to explain. You avoid topics that might lead somewhere deep, not because you're hiding, but because you don't see the point anymore. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. Shallow interaction leads to reduced emotional investment, which leads to even shallower interaction. And because this loop doesn't cause immediate pain, it goes unchallenged. In fact, it often feels efficient. You conserve energy, you avoid disappointment, you stay composed. But something subtle is happening beneath the surface. Your emotional range begins to narrow. High points feel less intense. Low points feel muted. You're steady, but also slightly flat. Life feels manageable, but less vivid. And because there's no obvious crisis, you don't feel justified questioning it. Modern loneliness often hides behind functionality. You show up, you perform. You meet expectations from the outside. Everything appears fine. And because society tends to equate outward stability with inner well-being, no one looks deeper. You might even reassure yourself that you're doing well, simply because nothing is visibly falling apart. This is where many people get stuck, not in pain, but in neutrality. Not unhappy, but not fulfilled. Not isolated, but not truly connected. And because neutrality doesn't demand action, it can last indefinitely. Another reason this kind of loneliness persists is because vulnerability has become harder. Not because people don't want to open up, but because the environments where vulnerability feels safe have become rare. Conversations are often rushed. Attention is divided. Listening is partial. And when vulnerability doesn't land well, it teaches you to be careful next time. After enough experiences of being misunderstood, overlooked, or met with distraction, you start to protect yourself by saying less. You keep things lighter. You present a version of yourself that fits easily into casual exchange. And while this helps you stay socially functional, it also keeps you emotionally distant. Over time, this distance starts to feel like your natural state. You forget what it felt like to be deeply known. You forget the ease that comes from being fully yourself around another person. Not because those experiences were insignificant, but because they happened long ago. Eventually, when someone does offer genuine closeness, it can feel overwhelming. Their interest feels intense. Their presence feels demanding. Their expectations feel heavy. You may tell yourself that you prefer independence, that you work better alone, that you don't need much from others. And in many ways, that's true. You have learned how to function without relying on anyone. But independence, when carried too far, becomes isolation. And isolation, when normalized, becomes invisible. What's important to understand is that none of this happens because of weakness. It happens because the modern environment subtly encourages withdrawal. Convenience replaces effort. Efficiency replaces depth. Accessibility replaces intimacy. And because these shifts happen collectively, they feel impersonal, structural, unavoidable. The result is a quiet kind of loneliness that doesn't feel dramatic enough to name, but persistent enough to shape your life. It influences the choices you make, the risks you avoid, the expectations you lower, and the version of yourself you slowly become. Many people assume that loneliness ends when circumstances improve, when work becomes less demanding, when schedules align, when the right people appear. But loneliness that has been normalized doesn't resolve automatically, because it's no longer just about circumstances. It's about identity. Once you see yourself as someone who is alone, not temporarily, but fundamentally, it changes how you interpret everything. You stop waiting. You stop hoping. You stop imagining alternative versions of your life. You settle into what is, not because it's ideal, but because it's familiar. And familiarity is powerful. It shapes comfort. It shapes preference. It shapes belief. This is why modern loneliness can persist even in the presence of opportunity. Even when people reach out, even when invitations arise, the internal shift has already happened. The baseline is moved. Reconnection now requires effort that feels disproportionate. It asks you to reopen parts of yourself you've learned to keep closed. It asks you to risk disappointment again. And when loneliness has become comfortable, discomfort feels unnecessary. So many people don't reject connection outright. They simply don't pursue it. They delay, they postpone, they tell themselves they'll get to it later. And later quietly becomes never. What makes this especially difficult is that the world keeps moving. Time doesn't pause while you adjust. Years pass. People change. Windows close without announcing themselves. And because nothing dramatic marks these moments, they're easy to miss. One day, you realize that reaching out feels unnatural, that closeness feels foreign, that solitude feels like home. And by then, loneliness is no longer something you're waiting to escape. It's something you've learned to live with. This doesn't mean connection is impossible, but it does mean it's no longer automatic. It requires intention where there once was ease, awareness where there once was instinct. And many people never make that shift, not because they can't, but because they don't realize anything has changed. Modern loneliness doesn't demand attention. It doesn't force decisions. It simply waits, and the longer it waits, the more it blends into who you are. If this resonates, it's not because your life is lacking in obvious ways. It's because something subtle has been happening beneath the surface, slowly and quietly. And understanding that process is the first step towards seeing your experience clearly, without judgment, without blame. If you want to keep exploring these ideas and understand how modern life quietly reshapes our inner world, there are more conversations like this here. Not to tell you what to do, but to help you see what's been happening all along. And sometimes, seeing it clearly is enough to change how it feels.